Hi everyone, welcome to this digital in context event. My name is Jonathan Klein. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Humanities and Social Change at Humboldt University in Berlin, and I will be moderating this discussion today with Albena Asmanova under the title Corona within Precarity Capitalism, Current Political Alternatives and the Role of Critique. Albena, a very warm welcome to you. I'm very happy about this opportunity to discuss your work with you today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very happy to be here indeed.
Albena Asmanova is reader of political and social thought at Kent University in Brussels, and she is the author of Capitalism on Edge, How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia, which came out this year, 2020, with Columbia University Press. She has also been publishing a series of commentaries on the impact of the corona crisis, appearing in Jacobin, the Financial Times, and most recently an article called Viral Insurgencies on the Perplexity of Protest During Lockdown, which is about to be published in Theory and Event. And it is this combination of timely analysis on the nature of present-day capitalism and even more timely comments on ongoing developments and struggles in the corona crisis, which makes her the ideal guest for this event today, continuing our series of events on corona capitalism. Now, I would like to start our conversation today by discussing in a bit more detail your analysis of precarity capitalism. In your book, you claim that it is indeed the massification of precarity which has become the social question of our time. And you set this focus of critique on precarity deliberately in opposition to a focus of critique on inequality. So as a start, can you explain in a bit more detail what you mean by precarity and precarity capitalism, and why are forms of critique, in your view, that focus on questions of income and inequality misguided? And maybe you can say also a few words about how you think this analysis fits in with developments since the corona pandemic, actually.
You know, the book came in January, and then the pandemic hit in February. And I'm so sorry to have been so right, because the main message of the book is, look, while we have been grieving over the rise of inequalities, under our nose, something more dramatic has been happening. And this is the generation of this massive precarity that even the rich are not safe from it. In my account, I claim, or in my analysis of the evolution of capitalism, is that such a condition of profound social and economic insecurity is not just a matter of impoverishment. It is a general social condition afflicting all, rich and poor, men and women, well-educated and low-skilled, irrespectively of employment status. Because even the anticipation of a job loss can make us precarious. Mm-hmm. Thus, precarity, I came to think, or the condition of existence without predictability or security, which affects not only our material, but also the psychological welfare of people, is affecting the 99%. This is the real grievance, and not inequality, as academic pundits and politicians keep insisting. Now, this generalization of precarity has taken place along two paths. On the one hand, as individuals, we're facing increased economic and social insecurity. On the other hand, our societies as collectivities are more fragile. This personal and collective fragility has become exposed by the pandemic. So this is the lesson I hope we have learned. Now, of course, there is a striking inequalities within precarity, and that should worry us. Some lives are more precarious than others. It is important to acknowledge that the underlying social dynamic is that of generalized precarization. if we are to act on this. Without that precarization, I claim, inequalities would not constitute a social injustice. They will be there, but inequalities are not always and not automatically a social injustice.
Right.
So this obsession with inequality, which has been kind of flagged out as the big injustice of our times, I took in my book to be a symptom that something else is wrong. So I asked, under what circumstances inequality actually becomes a social grievance, a social injustice? And my answer is this: in conditions of generalized precarity, or economic and social insecurity and instability, personal capacity, personal affluence starts to be a safety net. When the public authority doesn't provide a safety net, then how much income we have becomes extremely important. At the same time, however, let's remember that no matter how equal we make our societies, no single person or a group, a class, can be sufficiently affluent to secure for themselves a robust public safety net or public health system, because this requires enormous investment in education, research, science, training for doctors, equipment for hospitals, etc. So only a massive public investment in those things can provide the security and safety that people need.
What I very much like about your analysis is that you analyze capitalism in its historically specific form. Thus, you speak of changes of the modalities of capitalism, and you give an account of the present modality of capitalism. And with regard to this, you claim that neoliberalism destroyed welfare capitalism, but that precarity capitalism, in a sense, has mutated even beyond neoliberalism. Now, can you say a bit more about this historical shifts within capitalism? And why and in what sense is precarity a specific feature of this present modality of capitalism? Hasn't neoliberalism, for example, also already been very much about growing socio-economic insecurity and thus precarity?
Right. So I think of those. I go in the book. I go over a continuum of 4 types of capitalism. So first we have the entrepreneurial modality of the 19th century that broke down around in the beginning of the 20th century and was gradually replaced by the welfare or organized capitalism. Then we have that lasting up until the 80s, and was replaced by a neoliberal capitalism. And then I claim that since about the turn of the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, neoliberal capitalism has transformed itself into a new form. Well, these are iterations of the same social and economic order, capitalism. So they're not very, very deep breaks between them. And I will clarify the peculiar features of precarity capitalism in distinction to the previous form. But first, let me indeed acknowledge what you just said, that insecurity is endemic to capitalism. I was a little bit at a loss how to name this new format of capitalism. And in previous writing, I had called it, in my first publication about it in 2010 in Constellations, I called it reorganized capitalism, because the state is actively reorganizing the economy. Later, I called it, how did I call it? Aggregative capitalism, on account of the state's prioritization or the state's function of actively supporting not just industries as during the welfare type of capitalism, but specific companies. Rather than having an industrial policy, it helps specific economic actors that have a competitive advantage in the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
Then a friend advised me to call it precarity capitalism, exactly to stress. Amy Allen actually advised me to use that term in order to stress my great finding that it is that the precarity is afflicting not simply the working classes, not simply the poor, but really has become a state of being for the 99%. So indeed, insecurity is endemic to capitalism. No two ways about that. It is part of modern life, and it is, more importantly, part of the logic of profit making. You cannot make profit without risk, without investing, without owning property that you can lose without if you're not competing successfully. So there is always insecurity in the game of capitalism. But the correlation between risk and opportunity has been also very important for capitalism until recently. So one of the main kind of legitimating norms of capitalism has been the rule that risk and opportunity should be correlated for every participant in the economy. That is, if you risk your capital, you are rewarded with profit. If you risk your time, if you invest your effort, you are rewarded with gains. But in the early 21st century, public authority had started actually actively to aggregate the opportunities to those who already had a competitive advantage in the global economy.
And when is it that you date this shift?
I date that in the early 21st century. That is before the economic crisis.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my first publication on this issue is from 2004, and I had studied processes at the very beginning of the century. So this kind of use of the instrumentarium of intervention that the state had developed under welfare capitalism already, because it was managing the economy there, under welfare capitalism, it is using the same interventionist and distributive tools to actively distribute the opportunities to those who already have a competitive advantage in the global economy for the sake of securing, the economic advantages of the national economies in the global economy. But then, so while the opportunities are aggregated to the powerful economic actors, then the risks are aggregating to the weak ones. So this decoupling between opportunity and risk is a trademark of contemporary capitalism.
But in what way is this really different from neoliberalism? I mean, hasn't neoliberalism always been about intervening in the market when big financial institutions and other powerful economic actors have made risky investment decisions and got into trouble with them? I mean, it might be a neoliberal theory that reckless investments should be punished by losses to the lender. But in reality, didn't, let's say, the IMF, the World Bank always protect the investors and lenders? Didn't they always shift the costs to societies by imposing structural adjustment programs on developing countries, at least, let's say, since the 80s? I mean, wasn't neoliberalism as an actual political project always about this?
It is important not to dilute the labels with which we discuss society. Neoliberalism, if we understand it, as a certain type of socio-economic and political order, has basically two pillars. Well, this is my reading, at least. Individuals are held responsible for a thriving society. That's number one. Second, governments are held responsible for a thriving business environment. That was, these are the two dogmas of neoliberalism. Now, it's true that the latter element had already emerged within the post-war interventionist welfare state, as governments back then actively managed domestic economies to mitigate economic crisis. So in the 3 post-war decades, this was done through an active stimulation of production and consumption at the cost of irreparable ecological damage. So let us not glorify the welfare state. In the 1980s, in order to deliver on their commitment to increased material prosperity, governments in the West across the left-right divide embarked on what became known as the third wave of globalization. So this is the switch. The pursuit of economies of scale via global economic integration, which provided indeed lucrative market access, thereby rapidly increasing return on investment. That was the plan, and this became a policy priority. Now, the digitalization of the economy simplified this process as it allowed businesses to attain global reach with minimal cross-border investment. So that was the game that was set back in the 1980s. However, the inauguration of this globally integrated capitalism imposed a new policy priority, that of maintaining not just competition, because the neoliberal state was committed to competition, but to maintaining competitiveness of national economies in the global market, where capitalist economies were competing not only among themselves, but also with the autocratic capitalism of the likes of China, who maintained, at least initially, their competitive advantage by suppressed domestic consumption and depressed wages, as well by foregoing compliance with environmental regulation. Now, for Western governments, coping with these new competitive pressures entail applying to themselves those very structural adjustment policies that they had previously prescribed to developing countries. The structural adjustment package was invented during neoliberalism, but it was meant to be for the rest, not for the West. Yeah? So with globalization, in order to remain competitive, they had to apply the structural adjustment policies to themselves. And this, I claim, actually is the switch from the neoliberal form to the precarity form that is based on active intervention in the economy to help specific economic actors that ensure the national competitiveness, not competition, competitiveness in the global economy. Before the financial crisis, this kind of policy secured prosperity. And even after, after the financial meltdown, in the decade following the financial meltdown, we returned to growth. So the mechanism of economic prosperity did work with this policy formula, but it came at a very heavy social price. The competitive pressures on the whole society increased, intensified and broadened, and this increasing pressures on the Western societies happened along two paths. On the one hand, due to labor market deregulation and automation. So the latter allowed jobs outsourcing in search of cheaper labor. The political economy no longer supplied employment as a stable source of livelihood. Right. So we hold a job, but it is not enough to maintain our livelihoods. On the other hand, so the first part is this personal insecurity through insecure employment. The second is the thinning social safety net due to cuts to public spending on social services and social insurance. So this massively increased the competitive pressures on individuals who are forced to assume responsibility for impossible tasks, such as remaining employable and employed within a political economy that does not produce sufficient number of stable and good jobs.
And this situation actually brings about what you refer to as the crucial contradiction or contradictions that radical critique should focus upon, right? Can you say maybe a bit more about that?
I speak about the two antinomies or the two contradictions of contemporary capitalism. On the one hand, because of the spectacular technological progress we've made, technological innovation, we have an unprecedented capacity to produce the necessities of life with very little labor input. So I call that unprecedented capacity for decommodification, or it's a potential for decommodification. But at the same time, the pressures for participating in the labor market have increased on everybody. That's one of the contradictions. The other contradiction is that the political economy does not create enough jobs, but more of our existence, of our survival, depends on holding a job. So those two contradictions in combination generate this massive precarity on everybody.
Mm-hmm. What, in your account, is the reason that these policies get so widely accepted? That even though these policies bring about massive social precarity, a real legitimation crisis has been avoided. Is this merely a matter of false perception on behalf of societies?
I consider myself a Marxist, but I do not subscribe easily to the false consciousness explanations. I'm more inclined to look for the structural drivers of this common sense.
Right.
And in the new context, there's an unprecedented capital-labor alliance in favor of capitalism, in fact. Now, why is this the case? Our times are marked by proliferation of forms of ownership and of job tenure. So in the context in which Marx wrote, it was a very clear divide between private ownership of the means of production and then wage labor that is engaged to create profit just with human labor. But this is no longer the case. So to take the most striking example, even through our pension funds, we are owners of capital. That has created a very strong alliance, very deep interest, vested interest of the working classes into the smooth operation of capitalism. So when we have our pension funds invested in the stock exchange, we want that stock exchange to do well. But that also means that solutions such as involving workers in the boards in the boards of companies would not solve that problem, because it would only strengthen the capital labor alliance.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you suggest that there are structural reasons underlying this strong capital labor alliance, and they cannot be ignored when thinking about political solutions to our present problems.
That is the real challenge of our times, that very strong capital labor alliance that is actually deepening. The more we involve workers in the operation of capitalism, the more we turn workers into capitalists, the less chance we have to oppose that logic.
But when you have been writing about the alternatives ahead, you have alluded to the possibility that something like a Green New Deal could be a way out of this. And you have been writing that, well, actually the choices that we are facing are as different as were the New Deal and fascism, before World War II, of course. But for the current situation, you speak about the choice between the Green New Deal or disaster capitalism. Could you say a bit more about how to understand analytically the difference between the two, especially with regard to the role state economic policy plays?
That's right. You're referring to a piece the U.S. economist James Galbraith and I wrote recently for the Journal of the Progressive International. But now that you're reminding me of that dichotomy, actually, I want to rephrase that. I think currently we are facing a triple choice, not double choice. We are facing a triple choice: the disaster capitalism that brought us here, the Green New Deal, or, and there's more and more pressures for that, a return to the formula of the inclusive prosperity of the welfare state. And I think this is also a very bad idea, because it is that this inclusive prosperity which not only destroyed the environment through the policies of boosting consumption and production, but also created a certain idea of social justice as an entitlement to be middle class and increasingly prosperous. Social justice started to be understood in consumerist terms at that time. So there is this tendency to glorify the welfare state and this nostalgic longing for the welfare state and an attempt to return to this nowadays. So disaster capitalism and the return to welfare capitalism are two very bad ideas. The Green New Deal is an alternative. Now, what is the difference, you ask me, analytically among those models? This is how society provides for its material needs. Analytically, it's about that. So whether it puts the profit motive above everything else, both in disaster capitalism and in welfare capitalism, the profit motive dominates. The Green New Deal would only be possible if we abandon the commitment to growth. I'm not saying that we abandon growth, but that we abandon the policy commitment to growth, as we abandon the policy commitment to the profit motive. Now, there is a slight difference, but important difference that I will try to explain. There is a difference between the generation of profit when you are operating your economic activity wisely and smartly, and motivating your economic activity through profit. So Marx speaks of the profit motive, and that's important to retain. Our economic activity, if we're not wasting resources, might create profit, might create growth, but our policy, what policy should not be motivated by commitments to growth and to the pursuit of profit. This is the very, this is the switch to the Green New Deal.
You have been referring to the profit motive as a policy commitment, but is this really a political choice for capitalist states whether to conform to this profit motive or not? I mean, is it not rather a structural feature of any capitalist economy that the profit motive will have to be upheld, or otherwise this way of production wouldn't work? And in particular, when considering the pressures of the world market. I mean, also the various capitals are in competition among each other, and you need to guarantee a standard of productivity, a competitive rate of profit. Otherwise, capital will be withdrawn. You will not be able to sell your goods, and eventually you will stop being a capitalist. So isn't the dominance of the profit motive rather a structural feature of capitalism and not so much a political choice that states would be facing?
In my diagnosis, there is the bad news about this capital labor alliance that maintains this competitive going with the competitive pressures. But there is also the good news that this kind of life is alienating not just the most precarious, the most hit by precarious, the working classes, the marginal, the socially marginal, those who are struggling, but also the winners, because they're socialized to want a different type of life, to value the life of leisure, of culture, of family life. So the winners in this game of competitive production of profit are paying also too much of a higher price for being winners. And I claim that we're in an unprecedented point in history when even the winners of the game start to hate the game. So on the one hand, yes, we have the Capital Labor Alliance in favor of capitalism, but on the other hand, the social consequences of maintaining the game going are so nefarious for also the winners that we have an opportunity here for a very broad-based mobilization against capitalism.
Right.
And this is what I call, subverting capitalism from within. So the role of critique would be to question the available language, the available categories in which we have created the habits of critique. So far, I have found that critique has been trapped in a certain language of emancipation that has steered away from the systemic level and has been too much focused on inequality and exclusion, which is the relational level, and on structural enablers such as private property of the means, private ownership of the means of production, forms of ownership. So the role of critique would be to steer analysis towards the larger dynamics of the competitive production of profit if it comes to capitalism, but more broadly is to stay conscious, to stay skeptical of the available language. Until recently, we were too much captive of the language of inequality as a social injustice, and we could not see that there was something else going on. So the role of critique would be to steer away from the available habits of mind.
Let me push you a bit more on this role of critique, because I mean, we see social struggles and they are articulating a certain agenda. And now you suggest that, well, our analysis tells us what is actually driving them is social precarity. Mm-hmm. And now, how do we know that this is the case? Is this solely the case by our social analysis, that we have an understanding as theorists, well, this is the general concern at the moment? Or are there ways to find within their expressions, even though maybe not fully articulate, to find out that this is really what is driving these movements? So even though it might be at times very unclear, not clearly articulated, etc., is there a way how we can see in these struggles that this agenda is present and this is what is really driving them?
No, excellent. No, the grievances that particular social movements articulate, let's take the yellow vests. Their protest is about what? It's about purchasing power. They say, well, we cannot take this tax on petrol because we cannot make ends meet. We have to take these grievances seriously as analysts, but not on their face value. So what I propose, and I had already proposed it in my previous book, The Scandal of Reason, that we as analysts need to look at the more general spectrum of grievances and take the purported class enemies take the clash of grievances and seek the underlying structural drivers of both of the conflicting grievances. And if we do that, we will see how seemingly incompatible claims to injustice, to suffered injustice, such as young people nowadays, they can never get a break and enter the job market. Well-paid IT specialists in California complain that they can never leave on vacation because there's always work pressures. So the insiders and the outsiders of this economy, if we take what links their grievances, we will notice that there is a common denominator, and these are the increased pressures of the competitive production of profit. So that capitalism undergirds the grievances, the seemingly incompatible grievances of 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. So that would be, to me, the role of the analyst, to take those grievances seriously, but go beyond their face value and seek the structural drivers and the systemic dynamics in order to enable, this broad alliance of forces that can only help push our societies forward.
I very much like the way that you've framed the role for critique, and I think this is a very thought-provoking proposal. Another thought-provoking proposal of yours, I think, is the way you speak of crisis not necessarily being a driver for social change, but possibly also for, let's say, strengthening conservative positions. So if a situation arises where the existing system goes out of joint and where the survival of the existing order is or seems to be at stake, you suggest that, at least currently, this does not point so much in the direction of going beyond the given order, but rather brings about strong impulses to restore that order. And you speak of a state of chronic inflammation and the crisis of crisis in this respect. Now, my question would be, would you say that this is a general rule, that crises are actually not so much a driver for change, but rather for these kind of conservative impulses? Or is there something specific about the current objective social condition?
I believe that social crisis, to the extent that it creates insecurity, triggers always a desire for stabilization and therefore nurtures conservative attitudes. So that is the basis. However, this tendency can be overcome, these conservative tendencies can be overcome if there is a compelling utopia, as was the case in the late 19th century with the rising appeal of socialism. However, our times are marked. The peculiarity of our time is that we do not have such an utopia. For whatever reasons, socialism is no longer, it has been discredited by the autocratic, by the dictatorships that hijack that label for themselves. So the very idea cannot rally the masses. We don't have an alternative idea that is providing a way out. So this combination between the fundamental innate desire of people to stabilize themselves in a context of crisis and the lack of utopia to show the way out that marks our times is that combination that deepens those conservative instincts. Add to this the incapacity or unwillingness of the left to provide a robust systemic critique and rather going into this petit bourgeois ideas with equality and entitlement to material affluence, and then we arrive at a dead end.
If there is no vision of a different society, a different way for organizing production and distribution guiding us, How far can we move in an emancipatory direction? You highlight the importance for the potential for decommodification, which exists in the present modality of capitalism. But how far can we go in the direction of decommodification if we do not consider or envision also different forms of organizing the social division of labor, production, and distribution? So, to what extent can we actually speak about effective decommodification without a vision of a different society after all?
Now, I wouldn't suggest to focus critique only on the decommodification capacity of our society. Actually, I see emancipatory politics as running along three tracks. So the one is fighting a relational injustice, that is inequality and exclusion. The other working on the structural factors that enable the competitive production of profit, forms of ownership, tenure, etc. And the third is to fight systemic injustice. In my account, or in my theory, even though these are the three tracks of emancipatory politics, only the last one, the systemic one, is about radical, is the terrain of radical politics. So the thinking there is how to fight these competitive pressures. And altering forms of ownership would not do the job, because as we have seen in the experiment of China, but also in the experiment of socialism in Eastern Europe, state socialism, collective ownership of the means of production, that is fixing the structural enablers of capitalism, did not help much. So what can we do on the systemic level? What I call radical politics, and this is where I position these strategies of subversion. Well, anything that goes against the logic of the competitive production of profit has an added value. It can be very mundane things, such as renegotiating the trade agreements to include such high levels of labor and environmental protection as that would hamper the competitive pressures that are created in a free market type of capitalism. So any little bit that goes against even the most mundane things, such as universal basic income, or I would suggest things like granting social insurance based on European denizenship rather than nationality. So of disconnecting our social existence from participation in the economy. So once that you dampen the competitive pressures, then you can fully reap the benefits of the decommodification potential our societies already have. Because simply this commodification potential is being wasted by the competitive pressures. I'm suggesting that if we dampen those pressures or eliminate them, then we can really use this decommodification capacity that comes with the high technologies, with the development of science, to produce our life with very little input by labor. We have come to that point. I'm saying that these competitive pressures of capitalism that are a matter of political design can be eliminated, and then we will move our societies in some direction. I'm saying that we do not need to know in what direction we're moving. We do not have to give it a label. Actually, I think it is rather desirable not to designate, not to give it a specific direction, like call it some sort of socialism. That is not necessary because it might split the potential partners. We need a very broad alliance of social forces to move against capitalism, to subvert capitalism. That is why if we start, arguing in what direction we're moving, that would split the movement. So we'd better keep our focus on the process and fight the competitive production of profit systematically, this eventually, I believe, will generate a new form of society inadvertently, even if we do not posit such an alternative society as a telos, as a specific goal, and give it some magnanimous name. This is how I understand immanent critique as an intellectual practice committed to social criticism and eventually political emancipation and human emancipation.
What more could we have hoped for than to end our conversation with an outline towards human emancipation? I think this is the perfect ending for our conversation. Albena, thank you so much, not only for laying out, putting forward this analysis and for analyzing these pressing issues of our times, but also for taking your time to discussing these developments with me today. I hope we will have the chance to continue our discussion in the not too distant future. And well, thank you very much again. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. And that's agreed. We'll talk again.